Hello, third graders. Today we're going to learn more about traits and inheritance. All about inheritance. On Wednesday, we learned about our different traits and we compared those traits to people in our family. Many of you were able to figure out which traits you inherited from your mother or your father. Today, we are going to learn how that happens and why you inherit certain traits from mom and other traits from dad. You are all very unique. And what makes you unique is your special combination of traits. Traits are passed down in families. You inherit your traits from your parents. Your body is made up of millions and millions of tiny building blocks called cells. Each of these cells has a specific job. Skin cells help protect your body. Nerve cells help send messages to and from your brain, and muscle cells can help you bend and flex. Inside your cells, you will find genes, not the kind of genes you wear, but the kind of genes that are tiny pieces of code that direct everything that happens inside your body. Your genes control traits that you can see, like your eye color, your skin color, whether you have curly or straight hair. They also control traits that you can't see, like how well you are able to see color or whether or not you can taste a chemical called PTC. And if we come back to Pinewood this year, we'll do a really cool lab where you'll be able to test and see if you are a PTC taster or not. And that is a trait that you inherit. And remember, what is written in your genes is only one part of the puzzle. Your environment, where you live, and what you experience all play a part in shaping who you grow up to be. Think about your classmates. Each and every one of you is very different. How can that be when you all have genes in your cells? Every person's mixture of genes is unique. You actually have not one, but two sets of genes. One set comes from your mother, and the other comes from your father. We're going to take a look at the genes for tongue rolling. So we're going to take a deeper look at inheritance and how genes are passed down in a family using tongue rolling as an example. So on Wednesday, you practice this. Some of you know how to roll your tongue or can roll your tongue. I shouldn't say know how. And some of you can't roll your tongue. And that's a trait that you have that you inherited from either your mother or your father. Actually, a combination of both. We are going to show how a child can inherit genes to determine your ability to roll your tongue. Some of you can roll your tongue and some of you cannot roll your tongue. When rolling your tongue is controlled by your genes, let's see how this trait is inherited. When we study inheritance, we assign certain genes with letters. It does not matter which letter you use, but most times we pick the first letter of the trait. So since it's tongue, we're going to use the letter T. Remember that some people can roll their tongues while some people cannot. How is that possible? There are actually two versions of genes for tongue rolling. One for tongue rolling and one for not being able to roll your tongue. We will use capital T for the ability to roll your tongue, and we will use lowercase t to represent that you cannot roll your tongue. So if you have a gene, big T, that gene is the gene for rolling your tongue. And little t represents the gene for not being able to roll your tongue. Keep in mind that each person will have two of these genes, one from each parent. So for tongue rolling, you will have a two-letter code, and that code could be big T, big T. That means that your father gave you a big T as a gene, you inherited a big T, and you inherited a big T from your mother. Your code could be big T, little t. That would mean you got big T from either mom or dad and little t from either mom or dad. Or your code could be little t, which means you inherited a little t gene from both mom and dad. Some kids will ask me, what about little t, big T? These reversed. And the only reason we don't put that down is because the capital letter will always go first. So if you inherited little t, big T, we would still write that as big T, little t. Each one of these codes is referred to as a genotype. The genotype tells us which genes are present. So you have either the genotype big T, or you have the genotype big T, or you have the genotype little t, little t. Each one of these codes is referred to as a genotype. The genotype tells us which genes are present. Big T means the person can roll their tongue. Big T also means the person can roll their tongue. And little t means the person cannot roll their tongue. Our visible traits, or what we can do because of the code, is called the phenotype. So big T is the genotype, and that means your phenotype is you can roll your tongue. Big T is your genotype. That would mean your phenotype is you can roll your tongue. Little t is the genotype. That would mean your phenotype is you can't roll your tongue. If your genotype is big T, can you roll your tongue? Oops. Yes. If your genotype is big T, then your ability to roll your tongue is your phenotype, and you could roll your tongue. You probably noticed that when you have a combination of big T, little t, the person can still roll their tongue. For many traits, one of the forms of the genes may be stronger or dominant over the other. This means that when you have the two different forms of the gene together, the dominant form always shows up and controls the trait. We typically represent the dominant trait with a capital letter. In the case of tongue rolling, this is the big T. Lots of kids come up with really clever ways to remember this. Big T is stronger or dominant over little t. Big T is bossy over little t. And so whatever the gene for the capital letter, that's the one that's going to show up. It's going to overshadow or be stronger than the little t. And so that's why you can roll your tongue. The weaker form of the gene is referred to as recessive. We typically represent the recessive form of the trait with a lowercase letter. When it is paired with the dominant form, it stays hidden because the big letter or the big T is going to overshadow it or be stronger. And so you won't see the recessive trait because the little t is overshadowed. But when a recessive meets up with a recessive, the recessive gene surfaces for the world to see. A person who cannot roll their tongue will only be able to have the code little t. So if you can't roll your tongue, you know what your genotype is. It's little t. And this is because there's no dominant gene to overshadow the recessive. Remember that just because a recessive gene does not show up in a person's phenotype, it may still be there. And if it is there, it could be passed down to that person's children. So if you guys can roll your tongue, your genotype is either big T or big T, and we don't know which one. But if it was big T, you could still pass that little t onto your children, and then they might not be able to roll their tongue if it got matched up with a little t. Now, if you are someone who can't roll their tongue, you know your genotype is little t. If you have a genotype of big T for tongue rolling ability, this means your phenotype is you can roll your tongue. If you can roll your tongue, your genotype must either be big T, or big T. If you cannot roll your tongue, then your genotype must be little t. So genotype, again, is the code in your genes. It's the letters. And phenotype is what you can see or can do because of the code. In this example, it's rolling your tongue. But you could have other examples like eye color. Eye color, you would have different letters let's just say it was E for eye, big E, or little e, your phenotype would be your eye color, what the genotype makes happen. Your amazing genes help control everything that goes on inside of your body. Things to remember from this lesson. Dominant means strong and will overpower or overshadow the recessive trait and is always represented by the capital letter. Recessive means weak and will be overshadowed by the stronger dominant trait. All right, next you're going to open up the Google Docs all about inheritance and answer the few questions about tongue rolling. I want to see how much you understand about traits. If this is still confusing to you, don't worry. We're going to spend some more time learning about it. I hope it made a lot of sense to most of you. Things that you have to remember, there's 4 new words. Genotype is the code, big T, or big T, or little t, little t. Phenotype is what the code looks like. So in this case, it's whether or not you can roll your tongue. That's your phenotype. Dominant means strong, and that's the gene that will show up if it's there. Recessive means the weaker of the genes. And if 2 recessive genes meet up, then the recessive trait will show up. But if a recessive gene is paired with a dominant gene, the dominant gene will always be stronger and will show up. Those are the important things to take away about traits today. Like I said, we'll do some more practice next time I see you. But for today, answer the questions the best you can and submit that by Friday. All right, I hope you enjoyed learning about traits.